sometimes there are people who wanted to be soldiers, and for some reason that never happened. There's a few who are doing it for redemption purposes, who feel they've not led decent lives. A few who've ended up on the wrong side of the law a few times and who've been in jail, and they want to wipe the slate clean. There's parallels there actually with people who've gone to fight for ISIS in that respect. I wouldn't want to compare the two causes, but certainly the notion of war as a redemptive tool is something that you sense in some of the volunteers.
Hello. On the 27th of February 2022, 3 days after the Russians invaded Ukraine, President Zelensky sent out the call for volunteers from abroad to join the Ukrainians in resisting Putin's so-called special military operation. Over 20,000 expressed interest, but for those that made it out onto the front lines, combat proved far more difficult and less romantic than it had first appeared. Joining today is Colin Freeman, author of The Mad and the Brave, the thrilling account of life in the Foreign Legion for those volunteers fighting Russia. We discuss the struggles, motivations and courage of these extraordinary men. Plenty more history on the way, including a special on the Wars of the Roses. Coming up, it's Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Trent Park, and August's film club is Barry Lyndon. So if you like the pod, please do share. It really helps us to grow. In the meantime, it's me talking with Colin Freeman on Ukraine's Foreign Legion. Colin, it's a great pleasure to have you on. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hello. Yeah.
And so we're here to talk about your new book, The Mad and the Brave. And I have to say, I've been racing through it. It's just a real, just riveting. It just makes you want to know what happens to all these volunteers. And so for the benefit of the listeners, this is a book about the volunteers from abroad who are fighting in Ukraine against the Russians. And actually, this is the untold story, Colin. This isn't. I mean, we've seen stories in the newspapers, but no one's written a book about them yet, have they?
No, I mean it's not as if this is all secret stuff that is suddenly being revealed. I mean, I like to think there are a few bits like that, but it's the kind of what I would like to describe as the sort of inside story, yeah, where we try and scratch below the surface of what is going on and tell people a bit about how the Legion is going in general, and try and bring a bit more of a detailed ground level perception for people of what it's actually like to be out there fighting, and delve a bit more into why individual people have chosen to go out there as well.
Yeah, it was reading about each of these guys that you sort of pick a person kind of per chapter and follow their story. And I guess I was really interested because what's the motivation for a lot of these guys joining? Because not all of them have military experience.
No, I mean, this is one of the things that I found interesting was, what makes someone who is leading a normal civilian life one day suddenly decide, right, I'm going to go off and fight in a foreign war, not just any old war either, but the biggest war of our times since World War II, and also to be fighting on the underdog side against a superpower. Not only that, I think it's fair to say a malign superpower, or a superpower many would consider to be malign, who is not necessarily going to observe the normal rules of engagement, who's got nuclear weapons. I mean, it's pretty impossible to think of any more intimidating conflict to get yourself into, especially if, like some of them, you've not actually fought before and have no previous military experience. But yeah, the book has about a dozen different fighters in it. They're chosen, not quite at random, but I had to be guided partly by people who would speak to me, because a lot of them don't want anybody else knowing they're there. They're worried about retributions from the Russians and so on. Others, their own families don't know they're out there fighting. So there's quite a lot of secrecy. There's the usual mistrust that soldiers have for journalists. So you're governed to some extent by who will actually open up to you. But within that, I tried to kind of find people who had different experiences of different battles and different key episodes in the first couple of years of the war. So readers will get two birds with one stone. You'll get the stories of the volunteers, and you also get the wider narrative of the war. But in terms of their motivations, you've got different categories, really. You've got people who are ex-army, who have been usually spent several years on Civvy Street, who shortly haven't really enjoyed it, or who miss the old army life, miss the camaraderie, and in some cases miss the thrill of combat. Um, then you've got some who joined up for the army and since left, and then hoping while they were in the army that they would go and fight in Afghanistan or Iraq, but those campaigns wound down by during their time, and so they've never really had the chance for combat. They want to put their skills to the test. Then there are some who have actually fought properly in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and want to put their skills up against a peer army, i.e., the Russians, to really see what full-on, head-on combat is like. Which remember that's what the likes of the British Army trained for years and years and years. The bulk of the doctrine is around that sort of thing. The counterinsurgency campaigns are a relatively newer innovation, or just one string to the bow. And then you have some who have never fought before, and they, again, sometimes there are people who wanted to be soldiers, and for some reason that never happened. There's a few who are doing it for redemption purposes, who feel they've not led decent lives. A few who've ended up on the wrong side of the law a few times and who've been in jail, and they want to kind of wipe the sweat. They want to wipe the slate clean. There's parallels there actually with people who've gone to fight for ISIS in that respect. I wouldn't want to compare the two causes, but certainly the notion of war as a redemptive tool is something that you sense in some of the volunteers. So
But
it's a
ISIS,
real
sorry
mix.
to interrupt you, I didn't know that that was a motivation for ISIS fighters.
It is, yeah. If you look at some of the ISIS fighters, in fact, quite a lot of them who were recruited by people in the UK, certainly. There were guys who'd ended up on the wrong side of the law. They'd got involved in gangs, inner city crime, drugs, guns, etc. A preacher comes along to them and says, "Hey, if usually when they're in jail or at some point when they're contemplating, they're a bit of a crossroads in their life, and we'll say to them, look, if you want to purify your soul a bit, why don't you come and fight the good fight here in Syria or elsewhere? And you will cleanse your soul. And if you do get killed, you'll go to paradise." So there's that's the ISIS version of it. I wouldn't want to draw too many comparisons here, but certainly there are guys who I've met who've ended up in jail and who felt that by going to Ukraine, at least they'd have done one decent thing in their lives. They don't sort of spin it any more than that. They're fairly modest about it.
It's funny, I've been reading a lot of, as part of the job, I end up reading a lot about, obviously the big war is the Second World War. And one reads about military commanders and particularly in, I guess, history books, these sort of various tactical engagements and the more strategic are really well planned and executed because often you're looking at these sort of two highly professional forces, the Allies and the Germans. But reading your book, I'm kind of reading it with horror as a lot of these engagements that are happening. I guess this is the early days of the war. It feels like it just feels on the hoof. I guess it's an unexpected attack, but it just felt like the early days, the Ukrainians were really struggling to have a sort of organized form of defense against the Russians.
Yes, I mean, as we all know, the war came pretty unexpectedly. There was a big build up to it. Putin putting hundreds of thousands of troops on the Ukrainian border, but nobody actually really expected he'd be mad enough to do it, to actually send his tanks in. I think probably with any war, you always get a degree of chaos and mismanagement on the very front lines anyway. That just comes with the territory, especially if you're overwhelmed and outnumbered as the Ukrainians were. But I think it was the legionnaires, the foreign volunteers, who felt that particularly keenly. Just to recap, the Legion was created pretty much, on the hoof by President Zelensky on day 3 of the war. He announced on social media and on a brief speech, I think it was, that anybody who wanted to come and help defend Ukraine would be welcome. He did specify he wanted people with military experience. And in the and weeks that followed, next sort of 2 or 3 weeks, I think it was, they claimed to have had something like 20,000 people signing up. I think what that meant was that they had actually had 20,000 emailed applications or emailed inquiries rather than 20,000 people coming over the border. But certainly thousands of people did stream over the border to offer their services. And that was when things began to get difficult, because my understanding from seeing various internal communications to and from the Ukrainian government officials is that the Ukrainian military wasn't actually informed in advance that this legion was going to be created. It was perhaps a bit of a PR stunt by Mr. Zelensky to garner support from the wider world. And I dare say, hopefully, get some good NATO experienced commandos and paras and US Navy SEALs and the best of the best on his side. But the Ukrainian military didn't have any idea of what was happening beforehand, and they didn't have the organizational capacity to absorb these people. And they were also saying, look, if you remember back at the beginning of the war, every recruitment office in Kiev and all the other big Ukrainian cities had queues round the block for miles on end of locals, Ukrainians who were signing up to fight. They also spoke the language, so there was no language barrier there. Very few of the foreigners speak Russian. Many of them were also militarily experienced already because they'd been fighting the Russians in Crimea or in the Donbass, which is this conflict that's already been running for about 10 years there, at a much more lower level. So they had all the manpower they needed in some ways. And as a result, the foreigners found that when they first turned up, they often ended up in being confined to various barracks, which themselves were then getting missile quite often because the Russians were tracking where the foreigners were going. And being told, yes, we'll deploy you, but really there wasn't the organizational capacity there to do that in any kind of proper way. A few of the very best of the most promising people at the beginning, I think, kind of got pretty much what they wanted. They turned up, they were given a gun and a couple of weeks of training, and then said, right, you're going off to the front lines to help defend Kiev. I think that was the closest anybody got to the kind of soldiery experience that they perhaps envisaged when they first turned up. A lot of the rest, the common experience was, we've been sitting in a barracks for 2 months. The war is going on, and I'm cold, I'm wet, I'm damp, I'm not getting paid, and having come here, I want to actually get on and get stuck in. I don't want to be just sitting around for ages. And as a result, a lot of them then ended up sort of trying to bypass the Legion's official structures, and they would form little units of their own, maybe 8 or 9 people or something like that, who had got to know each other by languishing in these barracks, so that people who kind of broadly trusted each other. Maybe one guy speaks Russian or has a friend who speaks a bit of Ukrainian. They form they know somebody who knows someone who's in a unit somewhere else, who says that they could do with a few foreigners helping out, and they go there and they tout their services, almost like labourers looking for work. And that is where the opportunities start for some of them. They find commanders who'll say, okay, fine, yep, we'll give you a tryout, but it's very much on a kind of probationary level. And for a lot of the volunteers, what they found was, because of the language barriers, there was a limit to how much the commanders could integrate them into their own units. So they often ended up with doing primarily recon missions where they're going out into no man's land, trying to spot what's going on, doing a bit of recon stuff, looking at the Russian positions, so on, checking out what's happening. And that's something that a lot of British and American soldiers have good skills at. It was also something that not all the Ukrainians particularly wanted to do because if you're doing recon, you're basically testing the boundaries. You're going to be the person who runs into the landmine. You're going to be the person who hits the tripwires or strays into the Russian line of fire where you know you've gone too far. So on the one hand, they were doing valuable work, but on the other hand, it was very easy to end up in situations where they got killed or injured, and also to get a sneaking feeling, well, now, were we sent in there because they genuinely thought that was a tough mission and we were only the only people who were willing and capable of doing it, or were we being used a bit here as cannon fodder to test how far the Ukrainian forces could push before the Russians pushed back? And there's been all kinds of incidents like that. Which makes it very difficult for the foreigners because fighting a war, I dare say, is tough enough as it is anyway, without feeling that A, because of the language barriers, you don't really know what's going on, and B, that the other side, that the people you're actually fighting for might be slightly lukewarm about having you there and might be prepared to use you for only certain purposes that they're not prepared to use their own people for. There was a nickname that some of the foreigners said the Ukrainians had for them, which was free meat, as in people that they could just chuck at the front lines. Other nicknames were like the safari, yeah, the safari hunters are here, i.e., that the Ukrainians thought that some of these foreigners were people who were there primarily to, get a bit of a bit of action on the front line, shoot a couple of Russians, and then go home and boast about it. A bit like somebody going on a safari to shoot elephants in Africa or something like that. So it certainly wasn't the kind of nice, noble homage to Catalonia experience that I think some of them probably envisaged when they went out there. Although I dare say, if you read much about the Spanish Civil War, there were many similar experiences there. Wars are not as nice as people perhaps think they might be when they first sign up.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I wanted to ask you about this historical precedence, but I couldn't help thinking that is there a sense that some of these units are more of a hindrance than a help then to the Ukrainians?
That's certainly what some of the Ukrainians thought. And in the early days, because there was not much vetting, again, due to the lack of capacity, you did get some people who were eminently unsuitable for the front line getting given uniforms and guns. People who had no military experience at all, people who were mentally unstable, or just generally not people who should be allowed near a front line. Um, and as a result, I think there were quite a few Ukrainian commanders who had bad experiences with the foreigners, or at very least were told, had people going around saying that they were ex-SAS when they weren't, or ex-Navy SEALs when they weren't. These kind of occasions tend to be a magnet for fantasists and Walter Mitty characters. Unfortunately, not all of them. We're talking about a minority here, but enough to make a lot of commanders think again. And quite a lot of the volunteers, as a result, would be touring around, offering their services, and then the commander would be just like, "No, no, thanks." I think sometimes the volunteers even encountered a bit of hostility. There was a sort of sense of like these guys are just these foreigners are often just troublemakers. I wouldn't say that was the experience all the time, but it certainly seemed to be the experience of some of the people that I spoke to. Yeah. Um, and they often felt that they had to work extra hard and do a lot of diplomacy with the Ukrainian commanders themselves to try and make it, make themselves feel appreciated and useful. And they had to prove themselves to the Ukrainians. And again, that this was it goes back to the lack of capacity. You would have expected, and I think many of them probably did, that at the beginning that they would all just be put in big English or French or Spanish or whatever language speaking units, and that they would fight relatively in relatively self-contained fashion, where the language difficulties were at a much less of an issue, where the fighting culture would be much more of a kind of NATO doctrine, and where those sorts of issues would not come up. And it's perhaps sad that never really happened. Certainly didn't happen in the first few months, and I you get the sense that things have improved a bit since then. But we certainly never seen any stories about villages, for example, being liberated by an international legion of French or of British or a mixed international legion. And that's perhaps, I think, robbed them of some of the PR opportunities that they might have actually got if the International Legion had been able to go out, could be seen liberating villages, playing key roles in certain key battles as a large unit rather than just a lot of small individual units. Then the headlines could have been very positive for Ukraine. They could have spun it as, look, like, the world is behind us. This unit has got 50 different nations in. This shows us that the world does not approve of what Putin does. The world backs us, not him. And that could otherwise also have brought other people, other recruits to the fold. Instead, what you got a lot of was these stories that I've just been talking about of people feeling like they're being taken advantage of or simply unappreciated. And obviously, if you give up your life, your job, your home back in the UK to come and fight, and then people are, you know, indifferent about it, that's not a great feeling. And I think it is to the credit actually of a lot of the volunteers that they turned up. Then it wasn't as simple to get anywhere near the front lines as they hoped. And a lot of them could at that point, and a few of them did just say, like, all right, so stuff this. I offered my services, not wanted. I'm off home. And yet a lot of them did kind of stick it out and realize that they were going to have to kind of worm their way in, insinuate their way in almost by hook or crook, which, suggested that a lot of them were pretty committed to what they were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very impressive. But does what you've just been talking about suggest that really the numbers aren't? I mean, 20,000 emails arrive
Mm.
in this email address, but does that suggest really the numbers aren't sufficient to produce a kind of, brigade-like level of numbers to take Russian positions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a question of the numbers or whether it's a question of the lack of organizational capacity to put them together. My sense is it's very hard to get accurate numbers. Um, I mean, from what I can gather, at least from looking at Facebook pages that have been compiled of more or less news accounts of volunteers who've died, where there's no real reason to think that these are fake news accounts. At least something like 500 have died, and I think you could probably legitimately multiply that figure by about a factor of probably 10 or maybe 20 or more to come up to a figure of sort of how many have actually been out there. So I think you've certainly got the low thousands, quite possibly tens of thousands or 15,000, 20,000 in all over the 3 years now. Yeah. In the first few months, I suspect it may not have been more than sort of, um, you know, five or perhaps 10,000, but it's really hard to tell because so many of them avoid sticking their head above the parapet. They avoid any publicity. But what I have noticed is that quite often you'll interview one guy, and then he'll be talking to you, and he'll mention somebody else that someone else I've already interviewed also knows. So you sense it is a relatively small world, but it's difficult to say. I think they could have probably put together a couple of decent volunteer only battalions if there had been the organizational capacity behind it. And I do wonder, I mean, I think there's probably quite good reasons for this, but why they did not invite some Western military PMC, private military company out there to perhaps handle the training and organization. I think perhaps a trick was possibly missed there, given the amount of military assistance that was going on anyway, and given the fact that if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, both of those countries when they were when the the Americans or the NATO American mission in Afghanistan were training up the Iraqi and Afghan armies, often from very limited basic material. They brought in companies like I, I can't remember the names offhand, but
Like
several of the big,
Halliburton and
yeah,
Blackrock.
and Blackwater and all these private
Blackwater.
military contractors that have a track record in training up military, entire militaries, public sector security organizations, and they'll train them churn out entire units of Iraqi or Afghan army people. And yeah, you do wonder why that somebody didn't sort of say, right, well, why don't we do this? And that could have, in turn, created a better dynamic for the Legion and maybe also encouraged people then to go. Because, I mean, the other thing is that I think a lot of young soldiers in the UK and elsewhere are probably looking at the Ukraine war and thinking, like, that's the war we are going to be fighting, and we are getting no practice at it. And obviously there's issues about whether these soldiers were told right at the beginning of the war, a memo went round to all serving UK soldiers, you cannot go and fight. Don't even think about it, you'll get sent for court martial. But
But
yeah,
presumably there are senior military commanders in advising capacity out there.
not from the MOD or anybody like that. No, that's
Not
not
even covert or anything.
covert. I wouldn't know, but
Yeah.
I don't sense it. I have asked a few people as to whether there's anything going on there, and no, I sense that they're all people who they've had to that they're mainly Ukrainians or volunteers who have gone over there ad hoc. Some of whom quite often actually do go over saying, well, I could fight, but I'm 45 years old. I'm getting on a bit. I'm probably not really needed there. But I was a senior NCO, and I was responsible for 30 or 40 soldiers in my old unit back at home. And one thing I know about is how to train soldiers and how to teach them how to hold a gun and all the rest of it. So yeah, there would have been plenty of training capacity there. I do wonder sometimes why the West, NATO, or whoever didn't quietly send a few very experienced people at some sort of arm's length advisory capacity to actually carry out that sort of duty and formalize all that a bit, because I think the Legion has been dogged by problems of the upper end of its management for a lot of its time in existence. But then you're into that realm of like, oh, these are like Cuban military advisors that that we used to speak about when we when the Soviets were present in Afghanistan. This is all part of the creep. But I mean, we're already sending them weapons anyway, so. And there has been talk of various NATO training missions and putting NATO troops back into Ukraine in one form or another. So I'm not sure it would have been that much of a radical step.
And are they integrated now within the Ukraine military? I mean, drawing a salary and
Yeah,
officially part
technically,
of.
yeah. Every soldier who fights with the Legion is a paid up member of the Ukrainian military, so they don't count as mercenaries. Some people would say, well, that's a semantic difference. They are soldiers for hire. They're not really. It's certainly, if you look at the average salary that a Ukrainian soldier gets, it's something like $600 a month, I can't remember, $600, £600. It's not very much money. Certainly compared to a UK salary, you'd earn more working on the minimum wage here. And also, they get more if they're involved in combat pay, then it can go up actually quite a bit to something like £30,000. But though you only get that, or $30,000, you only get that if
Per
you're
annum,
no, per month.
per month.
It's not bad money. Sorry, hang on. What? So, pardon me, I'm talking rubbish. You're right. Equivalent of 30,000 per annum. Yes, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Um, but even then, it's it's money that you're being paid for risking your life on the front lines in the trenches, where the risk of death or injury is pretty serious. So for the vast majority of volunteers, it's not about the money at all. They'd be earning far more back in the UK, and quite a lot of them, I think, went out there unaware that they would even get paid, and a lot of them that don't think the pay the payment system is very efficient. A lot of them, I don't think, really bother about it. It only becomes an issue after they've been there for maybe 6 months without earning any money, and it would be nice to have a bit to pay some of the electricity bill in the empty flat back home, or whatever, yeah, so that you're not actually coming home actually broke, or what have you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, throughout the book, you mention homage to Catalonia, which is, of course, what one thinks of when one thinks of international soldiers fighting for a cause. And I have to say, it's been a while since I read it, but my overriding feeling after having read that book was that it wasn't as romantic as when I opened up the book and read page one. I thought this is going to be a glorious story of people fighting fascism, but it soon breaks down into ideology and it becomes quite depressing. And I'm three-quarters of the way through your book, and I have to say, it's not a hugely feel-good read.
No, I mean, there are bits of it. Well, I mean, I reread Homage to Catalonia as well before I started writing the book, and I mean that this is maybe typical Orwell. He likes to to slay myths. Um, so he talks quite a lot about how the fact that it doesn't matter how ideological you are, front lines are horrible. Where bullets kill people, and men wet their trousers because they're or shit themselves. I think it is because they're so scared. And he's very he makes no bones about the horrors of the front line. He says it's not nice. Um, and the volunteers I've spoken to, most of them don't don't try and sugarcoat it at all either. That was one of the reasons why I was usually one of the selection procedures was you want people who tell you it warts and all. Um, but on the other hand, most of them, none of them have kind of come back sort of thinking, oh, this was a nightmare. I wish I'd never done it. They all enjoyed the combat, I think, in one way or the other, or they got a buzz afterwards. None of them, several of them, I think, were admit to being pretty damn scared during certain bits, either beforehand, especially the ones who hadn't fought before, or during the middle of things where they're trapped in a trench and there's, you know, mortar fire coming in, shell fire coming in, and they're pinned down by Russian machine gun fire and got no apparent way out, things like that. That certainly, is very much combat in the raw. On the other hand, I've noticed that a lot of them have, when they've come back to the UK after doing a stint of 3 months or 6 months or something, and I thought, well, that's the last we'll hear of them. They'll go back to their old jobs and have a few good stories to tell down the pub, and that'll be it. Box ticked. And it's not been like that. It's more a case of, they had an itch that they scratched, and scratching it simply made it worse. A lot of them have gone back for several more stints. In fact, I think all of the dozen or so, with one or two exceptions of people who were taken prisoner of war and felt, because of the torture and the incarceration they suffered in Russian captivity. That's a slightly different story, but yeah, most of them have gone back to fight again. Why do they do that? Well, I think partly because they enjoy it. They enjoy the camaraderie. They must enjoy the combat to a certain extent. They're not going there just to hang around on the rear echelons of the front lines or anything like that. Um, but it's also they build a new family out there, of people that they want to be with, that they've risked their lives with, that they've formed in very close bonds with. Um, and when they're not in Ukraine, when they're back at home, they feel like their buddies, their new family are at risk. They don't want to let them down by putting their boots up and not coming back to the fight. And also on some occasions, they've got friends who've been killed or injured for whom they feel they need to carry the fight on, to to avenge their deaths and to make sure that the war in Ukraine is ultimately won. So they do develop quite quite close emotional bonds with what's going on, which did surprise me because a few of them I certainly thought, yeah, I think you'll be out there for a couple of months, you'll get the kind of the bragging rights, and then you'll come back. But it's not really been like that, definitely.
Yeah, I'm in awe of these people. One assumes, I guess it's a drive, a need to, I suppose, combat, as you say. That's the kind of drug.
Mm.
But a 6 month stint or a 3 month stint, you're going to develop a close relationship with Ukraine itself and the whole cause.
Yes, I mean, certainly that's another thing is that, and I've noticed that having covered many combat zones over the years, mainly in the Middle East and Africa, but in parts of the Middle East, like my first foreign stint as a foreign correspondent was in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. The vast majority of Iraqis actually was surprisingly friendly. I remember going there thinking like, I'll be lucky if I can walk down the street without somebody, shouting my name or whatever,
Was
or
that
being
early
aggressive.
on or throughout?
Yeah, this was right at the beginning of the war. I think I got there the day. Well, it was technically right at the end of the war. Actually, I got there on May the 1st, 2003, which was the day that George Bush declared major combat operations over, which is not a great feather in your cap if you're a war correspondent. But as we know, that the invasion of the war was the bit that went like clockwork. It was the occupation and the counterinsurgency where it all started going wrong. That was when I was there. So as I was saying, most Iraqis were very friendly. They bore no ill will to foreigners whatsoever. In fact, a surprising lack of ill will. But you did get terrorist groups springing up there who made it their business to kidnap and kill foreigners, whether you were a journalist like me or whether you were part of the occupying force. And for a lot of the volunteers who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan, who were there fighting a counterinsurgency and who remember the hostility often or the indifference of the people that they were ostensibly there as a force to protect, i.e., the ordinary Afghans, the ordinary Iraqis. I think they often felt like, what the hell is the point in being here? Why are we here? The people don't want us here. We can't, if we stray out of our base in many parts of Iraq or Afghanistan, if a soldier strays out of his heavily fortified military base, they'll last a matter of minutes sometimes before someone comes along and kidnaps them or whatever. They're getting their vehicles are getting stoned, by locals, children, and obviously worse, blown up, IED, that sort of thing. So for soldiers who have that recollections, the Ukraine war is a very different one where they feel like they're on the right side of history for once, indisputably. They're not part of some occupying force where everybody back home, even in their own country, can't make up their minds whether they should be there. And the Ukrainians were very grateful for having them there. And they would wander down the road. People would see if they're wearing a uniform. There's still often, an American volunteer or a British volunteer will wear a little stars and stripes or a little Union Jack on their lapels, and people will wander up. So, nice to see you here. Here's some homemade bread, or come and have a drink at my house, or all that sort of thing. And that's great. I mean, I said earlier that a lot of the Ukrainian commanders were sometimes a bit indifferent about whether they necessarily wanted the foreigners there for certain reasons, but among the people, it was a sign that a great morale booster, a sign that there were foreigners there who weren't just coming out to give humanitarian aid or whatever, which to some extent the Ukrainians don't need that much. They're capable of doing a lot of that themselves. But people are actually willing to fight and die alongside them. Western governments weren't prepared to put boots on the ground. Their own private citizens were, and that's a big morale booster for people. So, and also a great draw if you're there, the sense that you are appreciated by some of the people. It's also a nice country. It's not the kind of grim post-Soviet backwater that many people think. If in Kiev, you've got fantastic bars and restaurants, really nice places to sort of go and hang out.
So R&R is
R&R is great. Yeah, yeah. It's not
right.
like R&R in Iraq. I can tell you R&R in Iraq and Afghanistan has very, very limited opportunities. Yeah. This is a licensed war, you could say. So you can be on the front lines for a bit, but then at some point you'll get to go and kick your heels back and have a few beers and some nice food, which I think makes it a lot more bearable. And quite a few of them are thinking of buying a house there or settling down there. They get offered citizenship if they're proven members of the Legion. And for a lot of the guys who, the young guys from the UK, who, often being ex-soldiers, ex-squaddies, they're not made of money. They've not always had the easiest starts in life. In fact, I think that's a common thread. Um, and some of them say, well, yeah, I might settle in Ukraine because at least I can afford a house there. Houses are very cheap there. I can't afford, I'm not going to get a house in the UK, in a month of Sundays. So why not settle there? And they're held in in high regard if you're a foreign fighter. And the language is difficult to learn, of course, but there certainly is a lot of them see Ukraine as being a place where they can have a future. Also, I think from a sort of political, cultural point of view, they feel an affinity because some of them go as far as saying Ukraine is like the Britain that we kind of remember from 30 years ago, or I think the Britain that they imagine existed 30 years ago, uh, where sort of there's more cherishing of tradition, where military values are still upheld a bit more, and where old school warrior values of fighting men and that sort of thing are also held up, and not seen as something that is kind of part of that conversation that we have in the West about toxic masculinity and things like this. This is a place where being an old school tough guy, a warrior who's prepared to go out and use his gun, that those people are needed at the moment. And for men of a certain kind, that's especially ex-soldiers, that is an important psychological aspect to the whole thing, I think.
Interesting, interesting. And one area that I did want to ask you about, which is you have a figure, I think his surname is Harding, who's a medic for the Azov.
John Harding, yes. Yeah.
Yes,
Mm.
really interesting on him, and because the Russians have painted the Azov militia as these neo-Nazis, and that's not necessarily his experience.
No, well, in the Azov militia was just a little bit of backstory. Was set up in 2014. This was the time when Ukraine had had its pro-Western revolution, which had toppled the pro-Kremlin government of Viktor Yanukovych. This was the big street demos and so on. Um, and immediately after that, the country was in, a new pro-Western government came in, but the country was in something of a state of flux. At that point, Putin, clearly not happy about what had gone on, sent his so-called little green men, his troops without badges in to capture Crimea, more or less by stealth, because nobody had seen a tactic like this at the time, and nobody really knew what was going on. And also the Ukrainian army was in disarray at that time. There wasn't really a clear chain of command, nor obviously did people want to start getting into a head-to-head with Putin's forces. And then sort of as the months went past, and you then had a rebellion spreading into the Donbass area as well, the east parts of eastern Ukraine with pro-Kremlin separatists beginning to foment trouble in those areas and claim certain towns. At that point, the Ukrainians began to sort of say, right, enough is enough. But again, their own forces, their own army really wasn't in very good shape. It was ideologically divided. There was a lot of infiltration by pro-Russian undercover spy units, I think, or certainly, and a lot of the commanders were said to hold pro-Moscow sympathies. As a result of that, what tended to happen was you had ordinary pro-nationalist Ukrainians forming their own units, volunteer units, to go and fight. against the pro-Kremlin separatists in the east, and the Azov was one of the first of those. It was formed out of basically, I think some of the nucleus of the Azov units were ex-football hooligans who, like football hooligans in many places of the world, have a nationalist bent and are not averse to a scrap. So when the call for kind of a bit of street muscle was needed, these people rose to the challenge. They enlisted themselves in various militias, which the Ukrainian government kind of, was fairly turned a blind eye to, or was happy to sanction these people forming semi-independent units as long as they were going in and fighting the cause against the separatists. But certainly in the early days, the Azov did attract quite a few far-right Nazi people and so on in 2014. There's anybody who wants to read about to delve into this a bit more. There's a vast amount of literature to and from if you Google it about whether Azov really were a Nazi unit or not. But certainly as time went on, as the years followed, and by the time John Harding, this British volunteer or British ex-British serviceman, joined up, and he was a paid soldier with Azov. He wasn't a sort of volunteer at that point. They had, I think he said there was a few Nazis in the unit, but they were pretty much an ordinary military unit by then. And as he points out, he's been in the British Army and he's a career soldier for a lot of his life. He says you get people like that in any army unit, and nationalists. Armies tend to have a sort of patriotic outlook, and that attracts a certain amount of nationalists. But he said, for example, one of the chaps he was serving with was a Muslim from Crimea, and half the rest of the people, were not remotely interested in Azov's kind of far right ideology. And I think by today, I think that whole neo-Nazi thing is pretty much gone. I mean, they are nationalist, but that's not the same thing as being neo-Nazi.
No, it's an absolutely fascinating story. It really is. Well, Colin, I think we've reached our time limit. So I just thank you very much for coming along. It's been really fascinating talking to you. I wish you the links in the show notes for listeners, but I wish you all the luck with the mad and the brave. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.